I've been using all of this beautiful wool yarn to stitch up my medieval dragon here. Her name is Tanya. I've named her after the designer of this dragon, Tanya Bentham. I've been using the split stitch a lot in this piece, and if you watch the video where I talked about the variations on the back stitch, you might recall that I mentioned that I didn't really understand this stitch, and that is until I met Tanya. Tanya the human, not the dragon. Let me explain to you how it all fits together. So last summer, I took a trip to the UK where I signed up for a whole series of fun and interesting crafty workshops in quite fabulous locations. So after I left the fabulous West Dean College of Art and Design, I moved on to my next location, which was perhaps even more fabulous. Well, now I'm in a park in Oxford, and I'm searching for a bench that I'm told is dedicated to Tolkien. And don't you think this would be a good candidate for the party tree? Well, I found the bench dedicated to Tolkien. It's rather understated, as you might expect from the UK, but it is really quite lovely here. Let me tell you about why I came to Oxford. There are many fabulous things in Oxford. Some really incredible old buildings, some really incredible old buildings filled with incredible old books, other buildings with rather interesting portraits. Wouldn't you love to have that as your dining room? More fantastic old books, curious and interesting pubs, perhaps frequented by famous people, and quite a number of cats. And Sierra says, "What? What do you mean there were cats?" But none of these things were the reason that I went to Oxford. Okay, I did go to Oxford for all of those things, but I signed up for a class in medieval embroidery, and this was the piece that I started working on. And there's a lot of split stitch in this. That was not what the workshop was on, but Tanya, the instructor, Tanya the human, gave us an alternative which included a few different stitches, and this is where I came to appreciate the split stitch. So as it turns out that the split stitch is not meant to be a singularly decorative stitch where you look at each of the stitches itself and remark on how beautiful they are. It's meant to cover space. It's meant to be used as a fill or an outline. And if you use fluffy wool like I'm using here, the fluffiness of the wool fills in the space really nicely. And the individual stitches are not important by themselves. What's important is the whole area as it's filled in. And you can do interesting things with this stitch. Apparently in medieval embroidery, the stitch was used to fill in areas by going around in circles like I am doing for this flower petal that I'm working on here. And if you look at the face of my dragon, all of the stitching there is done in small circular areas that create the suggestion of a rounded face with the cheek and a nose and an ear, and they all have shape. And I'll leave a link to Tanya's video about how to do the split stitch for this particular dragon's face, because this is indeed one of her designs. And she's named hers Wilhelmina, but I like the name Tanya for mine for obvious reasons. And she gives you a really good explanation of why this works and how to do it. So I'm not really going to spend a lot of time explaining this stitch other than it's very similar to stem stitch or outline stitch, where you take a long stitch and then from the back side you go backwards and split that long stitch about halfway along, and then you take another long stitch, go backwards and split the stitch again. And if you're working with wool, you might find that it's even more difficult to thread onto your needle than cotton. But here's a little tip that I learned from some weavers in Peru. If you take the thread and you fold it over your needle and pull it quite snugly and then hold on to the ends of that. So there's just that little folded nub sticking out. You can often get that through a tapestry needle much more easily than trying to get the fuzzy ends off your thread through. And now back to stitching. So now I've finished the insides of my flower that I was working on, and I'm using the split stitch again in a contrasting color to create an outline. So there's a bold outline, and I tell you, medieval embroidery was mad. The colors were just so whimsical and curious. One of the things that Tanya said that I took away from the workshop is that in medieval embroidery, they were not trying to create beautiful stitches. They were trying to create a scene. And the embroideries were hung on the walls and mostly viewed by candlelight, so you couldn't see them very well. So how do you think you would stitch differently if your embroideries were only viewed by the flickering light of candlelight and each individual stitch was not important? That's an interesting question, isn't it? So another way of using the split stitch in a medieval embroidery is to do it with silk. And that's what I've used for Tanya's wings. And you can immediately see the difference between the dull wool and that shiny, shiny real silk. So that's going to be this week's bonus for my Ko-fi supporters. And I'd love to have you join us over there. I hope you've enjoyed this video and maybe I've inspired you to try making something beautiful. Bye for now.